north of Mount Everest, and you can see the receding of that glacier by 2007. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because the glaciers, the Himalayan glacier in this area around here is feeding all these rivers that are supplying the water when they melt, particularly in the summer, is providing the summer water for the growing of crops and water supply for millions of people in Pakistan, India and Southeast Asia. And we have a quarter of the population of China lives in the West and is dependent on this water supply. So we have the threat that already the glaciers are shrinking in that area and a thought that they could be completely gone by 2035. So we have millions of people's lives at risk in this area. We also have another factor that the hotter it gets, is the bushfires. We have unprecedented drought, heat wave, high temperatures in Victoria that are said to have been the grounds for that climate change was the factor that caused these unprecedented events that caused those horrific fires. And of course we have the forests that are the stores of carbon then giving out their carbon dioxide as the fires burn and increasing the warming. So we have another factor of an amplifying feedback where the hotter it gets, the hotter it gets. And of course, as the forests dry out, they don't store carbon dioxide. They, instead of storing it, it remains in the atmosphere. So we have another factor of the hotter it gets, the hotter it gets. We need, I don't know how that's happened. We need a safe climate. That wasn't my slide. Now, let's look at why the 2 degrees that's being talked about is really problematic when we know that all these hotter it gets, the feedbacks are already occurring. What the IPCC recommendations are that we target somewhere in this range as a limit on global warming, that we set a limit of somewhere in the 2 to 3 degree range. And yet we can see that once we pass this point, we've moved out of the range of human civilization. Human civilization, as we know it, was in this band of temperature. And what we're now starting to head out of the band that's familiar to human civilization into an area of grave unfamiliarity. And yet we're having people talking about 2 degrees as being a reasonable target. Why on earth are we talking about 2 degree target when we've already risen 0.8 degrees above the pre-industrial level and we're moving into unknown territory? Nature magazine has recently published an article called Halfway to Copenhagen, No Way to 2 degrees. And what they're saying is that the emissions targets that are on the table now from countries around the world in the lead up to Copenhagen would mean that global emissions, industrial emissions, will rise 60% above 1990 levels by 2020 and 100% above 1990 levels by 2050. So what Nature magazine is saying, that the emissions targets that are on the table have got no hope in hell, let's say, of keeping the warming to 2 degrees. That's why they've titled it No Way to 2 degrees. And 2 degrees, according to Barry Brook, who's from the Climate Science Department at University of Adelaide, he's saying that 2 degrees has the potential to lead to 3 or 4 degrees because of carbon cycle feedbacks, because of the hotter it gets, the hotter it gets. And these are the feedbacks that weren't in the IPCC recommendations. So what we need to do is we need to be cooling the earth. I'll try and use this little temperature. We have to. This is where we are now at 385 parts per million of CO2. what we need to be doing is getting back to the temperature in the 1960s at 300 parts per million when the Arctic ice was in place. Here's a quote from Schellenberger Huber, who is from the Potsdam Institute, who's saying, "We can't be sure that 330 parts per million is safe. Perhaps it's not a matter of whether we have 270 parts per million or 320, but operating well outside the historic realm of CO2 concentrations is risky as long as we have not fully understand the relevant feedback mechanisms." And again, we come back to these amplifying feedbacks. The hotter it gets, are not fully understood and put us in a very dangerous territory. On here, I've got written on the original 10 to 20 years ago, and this is now. 10 to 20 years ago, we had quite a bit of time before we got into severe impacts. The time for action is greatly diminished. We have, this is now, and this is the point of no return, and the time for action is greatly diminished, and that's what we're talking about today. So just to finish, I've just got a little bit of preparing for action is even a smaller interval of time. So just coming back to my point about the 2 degrees of deception and why we have a climate emergency. We have a climate emergency because of all the impacts were already being recognised that were happening much, much sooner than the IPCC said. And we have also a climate emergency because what's being talked about is a 2-degree target, which you can see is way out of the realm of a previous experience of human civilization. And secondly, we have no hope in hell of even retaining the limit of warming to 2 degrees the way things are heading. So indeed, we have a climate emergency. Thank you.
I've felt it, and I've been talking about it now for a few years, and I have been known to get a bit impatient with people who haven't shared my view, and I'm learning that there are very valid reasons why people have problems with calling an emergency and all the rest of it, which we'll go into. So this is helping me understand that, and that will help me communicate it better. And this is all part of us moving forward as a movement and being able to bring our society along with us. So the principles of emergency mode are that they help us lift morale. I mean, already I get a lot of feedback from people saying they're relieved when they hear it being talked about in these terms. So while it might frighten some people, it also relieves a lot of people, calling a spade a spade. Looking the tiger in the eye is something that you tend to have to do. It's about facing up to it and experiencing the full impact of the implications and experiencing the fear or the grief and the anger, all those things, because when we then talk to our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues, we're going to get some of those reactions. So experiencing them ourselves is part of our process, and it'll help us with other people going through their process. But the thing is about moving through it. And my experience with looking the tiger in the eye is that I've had to keep going back and checking that it is still there, that it is a tiger. And also what that's done is I've sort of become a bit familiar with it, and I don't feel like it's going to leap on me this very minute. So I'm feeling like, okay, I know where it is, I know what I have to do now and how much time I've got. So it's kind of helped. Being alert and observant, no panic. Emergency mode is not about panic. This is about being very clear-headed. It's about being very deliberate, not rigid, having flexibility built into it and being adaptable. Looking at preventative action, being on the front foot and being prepared to continue till the job is actually done, the job we want. We don't want a half-done job in this case. We don't want to save half the planet, half the species. It doesn't work like that with an ecosystem and, Gaia. It's saying also that failure is not an option. It is saying that we have to be very creative to get around the blockages and also to stay on the point. Be creative, but to stay on the point.